All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this clinical trials community of practice. My name is Nasia Safdar. I'm the faculty director for ICTR's multi-site investigator research program and the research director for the UW Clinical Trials Institute. So before we go to today's speakers, the announcement you see on the screen in front of you is for February 21st, our next meeting, where the speaker will be Professor Kyungmin Kim, who is director of the clinical trials program at UW in the biostatistics and medical informatics department. So for today's talk on engagement of PIs in clinical trials, we have two wonderful speakers. Dr. Rafael Veintimilla is a seasoned professional with over 30 years of experience in clinical trials. He's the Senior Director of Clinical Trials Integration and the Medical Science Liaison at the UW Clinical Trials Institute. He's dedicated his career to optimizing clinical workflows and enhancing operations for organizations of all sizes. In his current role at UW, where he has been for nearly 4 years, Rafael leverages his extensive background, previously honed at PRA International, to bring valuable insights to the intersection of clinical trials and medical science. Thank you so much, Rafael. And our second speaker today is Dr. Kraig Kumfer. He's an internal medicine hospitalist who completed his MD and PhD in cell and molecular biology at UW-Madison before completing residency at UW Health here. He has worked as a hospitalist at UH, Meritor, and EMH hospitals since completing residency in 2013. He organized a group of UW hospitalists to support inpatient clinical trials during the COVID pandemic in 2020, and his first role as a PI was for the UW in using tecovirimat for treatment of Mpox in 2022. Thank you very much, both, and I will turn over it to you.
Thank you, Nasia. First, I want to express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to present today. The topic, as Nasia mentioned, is investigator engagement in clinical trials. I would start with reading some little concepts here. It's not working. There we go. Investigators are vital to the proper execution of clinical trials, ensuring ethical, safe, and regulatory compliant studies while safeguarding participant rights and well-being. The other principles are: the principal investigator is accountable to study participants, University of Wisconsin, the sponsor, the Institutional Review Board, and government agencies for all activities and tasks carried out during a trial. This means that even if specific activities or tasks are delegated to sub-investigators, research coordinators, or other team members, they ultimately responsibility rests with the PI. So let's take a look at the PI's accountability. If the PI has accountability, like we mentioned, to the study participant, they should be engaged and worried about patient safety throughout the whole study. They should make sure the patient wants to continue the participation in the trial, that all the study procedures are being followed as a study protocol, and to ensure that the patient understand their involvement in the clinical trials. Engagement with the FDA and IH. This is kind of tricky. For pharmaceutical trials, investigator-initiated trials that have an FDA-regulated component with an IND, IDE, they have to report to the FDA and IH. With the investigator-initiated trials that are FDA-regulated, the PI becomes the sponsor, so they have a dual responsibility that we'll see later when the sponsor role comes in. And in the pharmaceutical trials, the investigator will communicate directly with the sponsor, and the sponsor communicates to the FDA. So we have to understand that in the investigator-initiated trials, the investigator becomes the sponsor also. Of course, we have to follow rules and regulations for the Office of Human Subject Protections, the IRB. Importantly, we need to get all our trials and documents approved by the IRB. We have to follow the approved IRB protocol consent form, and any communications that we're sending out to the participants has to be IRB approved. Also, the continuing communication with the IRB for continuing review, reporting adverse events, violations, and all those has to be constant by the PI. Of course, following UW Health Madison policies and procedures. And here's the sponsor obligation. In pharmaceutical trials, this is easy. We'll report to the sponsor like Bayer, Pfizer, but in the investigator-initiated trials that have the FDA IND component or regulated, they become the sponsor and the investigator. And this is very important, especially in multi-site studies that the investigator has to assess the feasibility of other sites and make sure they will follow the protocol, communicates with these sites with IND safety reports and everything, and also communicates with the FDA when there's a protocol amendment issues or problems with the study. And lastly, we can't forget our local government and state rules and regulations. The investigator may delegate some or all activities of clinical trials. This is important, and I know investigators that are able to do from 0 to 10 all the study activities. They don't need any help and everything, but those are few and far in between. But if the investigator is capable of doing all the trials, they have to comply and be engaged in all the process. In reality, for a lot of doctors, this is not possible. They have their own job, they have a lot of commitments, and they have to do their clinical activities. So they can delegate some or all the activities, but they may not delegate the responsibility or accountability of study trials. And with all the statements and the accountabilities that we have, I still don't understand why some PIs are not more engaged in their own personal clinical trials if they have all these responsibilities and accountabilities. As I mentioned, we have the investigator-initiated trials. They can be FDA regulated and non-FDA regulated. If they're FDA regulated, they become the sponsor also and more obligations of reporting structure, even with their IND approvals and things like that. They need to get the protocol approved by the FDA, IRB, and make sure everybody will follow the protocol. We also have federal clinical trials. These would be NIH grants, Department of Defense. They are a mixture of investigator-initiated pharmaceutical trials or NIH trials. And of course, we have the pharmaceutical trials that, in my point of view, we get the full protocol up front, and then we go from there to be able to implement the trial and operationalize the study at the UW. For the study protocol, I want to make a couple of these statements of protocol. You have to understand that when we do a pharmaceutical study, the pharma company, Pfizer, Bayer, they give us the study protocol already written and approved by the FDA. When it's an investigator-initiated trial, that responsibility falls on the investigator to develop an appropriate protocol that can be executed or operationalized in UW. So a well-written protocol is the most important quality control during a clinical trial if we're following all the specific procedures and outlines in the protocol. A well-written protocol ensures the study is designed precisely to test the hypotheses proposed. It ensures that the target population is being enrolled and following the procedures in order to minimize any variability in the study. It's important to mention that the information in the protocol be consistent with the information provided in informed consent in other study documents. This is important, especially with information that might be contained in the clinical trials agreement or in the protocol. It must match the informed consent. I normally tell people when they develop the informed consent is a summary of the study protocol for the patient to understand what they're committing to. So when we develop the study informed consent, the PI's engagement and involvement is to make sure that the informed consent is written correctly, addresses all the issues, and the patients, all the questions of the patients are answered when we have the exchange information during the informed consent process. In the sponsor feasibility assessment and site questionnaire, I'm going to address this for pharmaceutical trials and for investigator-initiated trials that are FDA regulated. The feasibility basically is the potential sites are identified, this by pharmaceutical companies or by the investigator-initiated trial that's acting as the sponsor. The detailed information about the site's capability, infrastructure, experience, and staff qualifications are collected to see if there could be a potential site for the study. Once the site gets selected, of course, after we sign CDAs and we do other things, we might get a study protocol. The study protocol, like I mentioned before, in this case, if it's an investigator-initiated, it's going to be written and already assessed all the things pertinent to the protocol writing, how we can operationalize and patient population and everything. But once we get the protocol from the investigator-initiated or from the pharmaceutical company, we can do a site feasibility assessment. In the investigator-initiated trials, while they're doing the study protocol, I hope they've already analyzed and seen the site feasibility assessment to be able to execute the trials at the site. With patient population, the target population, we would need to do a preparatory research to see if we have the correct patient population for the trial when we're writing the protocol or doing the site feasibility. Communicate with all the stakeholders in ancillary departments. We're talking about radiology, lab, are we able to perform the procedures that they're requiring with respiratory therapy? We had a COVID study that they were requiring us to switch the patient's positions every 2 hours, and respiratory therapy, nursing said that would be impossible. In 24 hours, we would be moving the patient 12 times a day, and that's unacceptable. So always consult with ancillary departments while you're developing the protocol or when you receive the protocol to see if it's feasible, and we do those tests here at UW. Workflows. We have to understand that we need to identify the workflows in the hospital, in the clinics. Are we going to interrupt the workflow? Are we going to cause problems? Are the nursing managers and nursing staff aware of the study so they can help us do the study? How it would be the easiest way to enroll? Where would be the patients that we could identify? Are we identifying patients in primary care? Are we identifying patients that are going to surgery? Are we doing a workbench report of patients that have an abnormal path that serves the purposes for the study? We have to all that figure out with the study protocol. Of course, study personnel, we can't forget, we need the study PI. If they can't do the study all by themselves, they will need personnel for regulatory purposes, study coordinators, fiscal, financial, and other situations to be able to manage the study. But again, the PI is responsible in training and making sure the staff is following the study protocol. Development of budget is very important, and I have here that it's standard of care versus research procedures. The investigator-initiated trials, as pharmaceutical trials and any other trial, is important to develop an adequate budget. We can't just accept the budget that's proposed by a pharmaceutical company. We have to make sure it covers our costs. We're covering everything that we have to pay. But the easiest way, and I know a lot of people don't do it this way, is using the schedule of events on the clinical trials. And, sorry. So the schedule of events, or the X chart that we call it, on a clinical trials has all the activities, all the procedures that are going to be done. Everything that's highlighted in yellow would be research related only. Everything that's not highlighted would be standard of care. Understanding that some of these visits could be a mixed visit. It could be a standard of care visit with research component, but we still have to account for that budget and the cost that might incur. So sometimes there's EKGs that they're asking for 6 or 7 EKGs with triplet copies. We have to budget that. But the other important thing, the engagement of the PI, is understanding the protocol and making sure that this chart captures all the things that we require. Sometimes the schedule of events will say lab work, basic metabolic panel, but it doesn't have phosphorus or magnesium. But in the protocol, it says that we need phosphorus and magnesium. We have to make sure we're putting that on the budget and developing the budgets accordingly. So this is very important in the budget. Also, it helps us determine CPT codes. The PI should be able to provide us CPT codes to make our folks in finance easier to develop a budget and negotiate with a pharmaceutical company. Also, in the investigator-initiated trials, they can come up with the CPT codes to be able to get precise pricing when they submit to the federal government for grants or R01s and things like that. We have to consider the length of visits, how it will interrupt the workflow, log processing, additional costs that might be. I also like for the PI, once they determine this, to sign and date, because this chart can also be used for Medicare cover analysis and to prevent also double dipping with Medicare and getting into other situations. So I also like to use this chart, the way it's developed, approved by the IRB, to be able to share with the patient when they're doing studies. That way the patient's very clear when they get a bill from the hospital or not, what was standard care, what was research. Now, you don't have to use that, but it helps the patients understand their involvement in the trial. Submission to the regulatory agencies and IRB, as I mentioned before, investigator-initiated trials are the sponsors, so they have to submit it to the FDA in addition to the IRB. If you're doing a pharmaceutical trial, the pharma company will submit it to the regulatory agency. We're responsible submitting to the IRB. When we submit to the IRB, it's important that the PI understands and is engaged and communicating to the IRB the enrollment and the capacity that we're going to be doing the enrollment plan or recruitment plan. The site initiation is the opportunity that the PI, as an engaged person, can train everybody to do the trial according to the established protocol. In a pharmaceutical company, they will send out the monitors to do all these. Supervision and oversight of the trial. This is very important. We have to train staff. We have to review the procedures, ensure that everybody's following their approved IRB protocol. The staff has to be trained or adequate or qualified according to education, training, and experience. The recruitment plan also is important to be able to develop in the protocol, and after we do the feasibility, developing the patient population. Does it make sense? How is the best to ID patients? Is it better to do preparatory to research? Is it a bench report to find out the patients? Where can I identify them in primary care with pathology? And also, to do all this, it's also good to request from the IRB a waiver of screening and recruitment. The recruitment plan is important to establish to see if it's able to be accomplished at UW. How is the plan going to be done? Are we going to review a list of patients that the department has of a registry of patients? Are we going to approach patients that are coming in with a disease process at that moment, or they're getting an echocardiogram or a heart or a procedure, surgical procedure? Eligibility participants, we need to follow the protocol, but the engagement of the PI here, it's very important. They have to determine the eligibility of the participants according to the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Documentation, as Kraig will show us later, is very important, and it shows the engagement of the PI, that the patient is eligible to participate in the study, that they signed informed consent, that they are randomized to trials. But going through the eligibility, the problem with the FDA when they do inspections is they don't know who did the eligibility, and they can't determine that the PI was involved in the eligibility. So the engagement there is very important. The informed consent process, as I mentioned, it should be an exchange of information, making sure the patient understands what we're asking them to commit to, and making sure the informed consent matches the study protocol and the injury section of the study. Here's an interesting thing about the informed consent. Nationwide in 2022, on average, 79% of the US population were literate, 21% of the adult population were illiterate, but out of the literate population of 79%, 54% of the adults had a literacy level below 6th grade level. So it's important to even question the pharmaceutical company's consent form when they're written at a higher level of literacy. A lot of people believe that we can't question the pharmaceutical company, but that's incorrect. We always can question the pharmaceutical company. Assessment of adverse events and serious adverse events. You can imagine the PI or the investigator is important for them to assess the severity, the causality, and the seriousness of the adverse event until it clears up. Also, deviations, violations do happen. The FDA has the violations for a reason, but when these happen, the engagement of the PI is important to see if the deviations are constantly happening in the violations, to see if there is a trend, identify if there's a system problem, retraining of staff, that maybe the protocol is off a little bit. So that's where the engagement of the PI comes in. Also, when the recruitment plan or the deviations happen, it's the responsibility of the investigator to ask themselves, why is this study not enrolling, or why are we having so many deviations or violations? We create corrective action plans. It's important that the PI be engaged in these corrective action plans because they know about it, and they can do a root cause analysis by doing an investigation, identifying the problem. The CAPA development plan, how is it going to fix? A lot of CAPAs that I've seen, they just put training. There's only so much training that we can do to avoid, things happening, but the problem keeps on existing. So we have to come up with a better development. Implementing an oversight of the CAPA plan is important also. The verification of the effectiveness. We just don't create the CAPA plan and forget about it. We want to make sure it's working and it's doing what it's supposed to. The delegation of activities. This is another source subject from some studies. I know it's not a requirement from the FDA or for investigator initiated, but the FDA does require that when delegations of activities are delegated to staff, that it be documented by experience, training, or expertise on how this person was delegated. So you would have to go through all the regulatory file to find, their CVs, their trainings, and everything. The best way that I have found is, creating a delegation log. On the top portion of the delegation is the site information. We have the person that's being delegated the function, their signature, the initial start date, the role in the study, and the key tasks. And then, of course, the PI will sign off on their start date and end date. And for the key task, we have this type of delegation. Number 1, coordinates interviews, does informed consent. Number 3, confirms eligibility, and so forth. and it should be delegated appropriately according to the qualifications of the person. I want to read a part of an inspection letter from the FDA. This is an actual letter. It says, while you're delegated certain study tasks to individuals qualified to perform them, as a clinical investigator, you must adequately supervise those whom you delegated authority. Our inspection indicates that you failed to personally conduct or supervise the clinical investigation. Our inspection revealed that you had little personal involvement in the conduct of the study beyond conducting limited number of physical examinations and so forth. So you could see that this is not correct. And what the FDA at the end says is it's that the investigator was not involved in protecting the rights and safety or welfare of human subjects. Now I will turn it over to Kraig so he can give those specific examples and his presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Rafael. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you, Rafael. I hope at this point we're able to see
Yes, we can see your
a slide that
there.
says engaging clinician investigators in trials, and that hopefully there's a red spot off to the side.
We can see that.
So I'm going to take, and I want to thank Rafael for outlining the responsibilities for investigator engagement in clinical trials, particularly that of the principal investigator. And I'd like to take a slight pivot with engaging clinician investigators in clinical trials. I know there are many people that spend all of their professional time engaged in clinical trials and really have a high level of expertise. And I would like to recommend or make the argument that we should be involving clinicians whose primary job is that of clinical work in clinical trials, and that this can increase engagement of investigators and improve the quality of our trials. Specifically, if I can get my slide to advance. That's interesting. Get out of your way.
Okay. Oh, there you go. Got it. Okay.
Specifically, I'd like to argue for involving more clinicians as co-investigators or as principal investigators of clinical trials, and to provide some examples of tools and workflows that we've generated in the UW Hospital Medicine Trialist Group that engage clinicians and demonstrate investor engagement in the conduct and planning of the clinical trials of which we've been a part. So there are, again, many people, especially at the UW, that are experts in regulatory or research pharmacy or IRB, or many other aspects of conducting clinical trials. And I've been very fortunate to be able to work with a number of study coordinators who have participated as part of trials. But I think there are a number of points during the decision, implementation, and conduct of a trial where it's useful to have clinician investigators as part of the study team. This begins even before a trial is agreed upon. So evaluating the suitability for a study for a particular site when taking care of patients, especially those who are not healthy patients, is key to have clinicians caring for that patient population in those sites. It's important when trying to design the study itself for the site or trying to implement a multi-site trial at a new site. And certainly it's important in the conduct of the trial itself. Rafael pointed out one of the ways in which clinicians can be particularly useful, and this can be done very early in the process of determining a clinical trial, ideally at the time that a budget is being developed and before any contracts are signed. Clinicians have particular insight into what kinds of procedures are going to be standard of care or routine care for the management of patients with particular problems in particular situations in a particular region of the country. They can identify which portions of patient care would be routine and wouldn't be billed to the study and which parts might be. This gets particularly complicated, especially in therapeutic trials of non-healthy patients as subjects, and you could spend easily an hour just delving into that. But I think involvement of clinicians who care for the patient population is critical early in the process of designing your trial and its implementation at any given site. This is not only because of determining what's going to be billed and what's not, but there may be additional processes. Rafael mentioned, the adding of phosphorus or magnesium that's required by the protocol, even though it wouldn't be part of the basic metabolic panel. Other situations I've seen have included things like administration of a study drug needed to be completed by actually flushing the lines with some sort of crystalloid that wouldn't be part of the schedule of activities. And a clinician who's used to administering medications would recognize that that could be needed. Additionally, during the choice of implementation of trials and the implementation itself, I think clinicians are particularly well suited to identify logistical and practical barriers that might not be immediately obvious to people who don't spend most of their time engaged in clinical care. And these can run a gamut of possibilities. One kind of practical barrier that I'd like to bring up is, as a hospitalist, we were considering a clinical trial for hepatorenal syndrome that was going to involve, patients that were going to receive care from nephrology and from hepatology. And one of the groups recognized that the current standard of care is a set of treatments that were thought to have reduced benefit or not a whole lot of benefit to the patient, and that we need better alternatives. And so the trial was going to compare placebo to a new intervention. And one of the groups thought that, this would be an excellent trial to do and to move forward, and that it was of value. But one of the other groups recognized that even though the current standard of care wasn't thought to provide a great deal of benefit, that they were uncomfortable having patients being randomized to the potential of placebo. And so even though the trial had scientific merit, it was going to be difficult to implement if one of the groups caring for the patients was not going to be comfortable with patients being enrolled. We were not going to be able to generate good data and follow the protocol. So that was one where we weren't able to advance, even if we had the other logistical capabilities. One issue that I face as an internal medicine hospitalist, but I'm sure is shared amongst others, is that the clinicians that care for patients oftentimes are handing off as the patient's care progresses. In one such example, we have a trial that's active now where patients start in the intensive care unit with our critical care team. Here at UW, we have a closed ICU, so hospitalists aren't managing critical care patients. And so for this interventional trial, patients were going to be consented, randomized, and start on treatment while they're in the ICU. But these patients, most of whom were expected to improve and to be able to step down to a medicine service. And so the transition from one set of clinicians to another set of clinicians is something that, as a clinician, I can anticipate. If you get each of those groups of clinicians involved in the planning, we can make sure that the handoff of the patient's clinical care also allows handoff of the trial expectations for that patient. This reduces protocol deviations, reduces confusion, and makes it much easier to implement the trial if everyone who's going to care for the patient or the groups that are going to care for the patient know about it at the beginning. Additionally, I tend to think about discharge a lot as a hospitalist. And so transitions from an inpatient setting to an outpatient setting are another area of concern, where involving clinician investigators early can identify how to make that work, or in some cases, situations that aren't going to work. And I had one trial that we weren't able to open that was going to involve a non-FDA approved oral medication in a patient population that was very likely to need skilled nursing facility post-discharge because of the condition that was being tested. And frankly, our skilled nursing facilities in our region are not willing to store and administer experimental medications to patients that are under their care. So rather than getting into a situation where we were going to start patients and then end up violating the protocol because we couldn't complete the study, we unfortunately had to pass on that one. Clinicians may also be able to identify time intervals in a protocol that are simply not going to be feasible. For instance, in many inpatient trials, the inclusion criteria require short time frames between some sort of presentation, like an admission or onset of symptoms, and the initiation of a clinical study drug. And so knowledge of the process of how a patient actually would present and be identified is particularly useful to figuring out whether or not we're going to be able to identify these patient populations in sufficient quantities that we could actually get them enrolled during that sort of time frame. Other times there are time frames between events, clinic visits, or a hospitalization and a follow-up clinic visit, or where clinicians may recognize what the capacity limitations are in order to get patients into those sites of care. There could be something as simple as if you have visits that have to be every third day, realizing that that means that sooner or later you're going to run into a weekend and that you may need a facility that isn't available in the way that the protocol was written. At least this way, those problems can be identified early and be integrated into how the implementation is going to work. Probably the biggest issue that I face as a clinician interested in clinical trials is getting an appropriate number of subjects into the trial. So finding the subjects, whether it's on registry or because there is some sort of initiating event, is a situation that I encounter quite a bit. Here at UW, those that are only involved in research and have no clinical activity have some impaired access to the electronic medical record that makes this a little more difficult here. Frequently, I think both here at UW as well as at other sites, it may be valuable to have clinicians who are able to identify the patient populations. One way that we've dealt with this with the hospital medicine trialist group is that we use patient lists that integrate clinical data into our screening. All of the information up here is of fictitious patients. No one's actually named flagellum or deoxyribose. But this is the kind of patient list we were using during our COVID trials to identify patients that were admitted to the hospital with COVID. The list had a high sensitivity because it included all inpatients that were in the isolation that was required for COVID. But we could use these tools to actually import information that had been written by the clinical team before the involvement of any trialist or study staff. And so we could see for protocols that required that patients be admitted for COVID-19, that if someone's chief complaint as determined by the clinician is not COVID, that this is not a patient that we need to approach, and we can more quickly identify those patients whose main problem, for instance, might be listed as COVID-19 that would be appropriate to approach. We can get information about their comorbidities to help with the screening and speed that up, even if it's produced by the clinical team, rather than having to rely entirely on de novo annotation by the study team. And it gave us the opportunity to make notes about what the study team has done in terms of approaching the patient. Those notes could be available to the study team, and the clinical teams had the ability to access those notes if they wanted as well. We found that this helped to improve the number of patients that we were approaching compared to some of the other measures that we had taken. Another way that we can have the investigators engaged in the conduct of the trial and can document that engagement is by going through the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Sometimes inclusion and exclusion criteria are very cut and dry, like a patient has an inclusion criterion of being 18 years or older. Sometimes it requires some clinical expertise to say that they are admitted for a particular problem when sometimes the documentation is not entirely clear, or in the case of this example, that a hospitalization is expected to last beyond a particular period of time. Some of those clinical factors may be known to a clinician investigator that might not be immediately obvious to someone who doesn't spend most of their time in clinical practice. The approach that we took was to have investigators documenting the inclusion and exclusion criteria in research notes that were directly in the patient's electronic medical record, so that others caring for the patient knew why they were being admitted, and that none of that information was being withheld from the clinical team. It also provided an identification of who one could contact if questions came up, as well as things like who is the principal investigator of the trial. Additionally, clinician investigators may have a familiarity with a patient population that varies from study to study. Even though I'm a hospitalist and in theory, longitudinal care of my patients is not a priority, or is not thought to be a strength of my specialty, there are many patients that I see over and over again. And my knowledge of those patients and that population helps me to identify barriers that patients might have in complying or adhering to a study protocol, as well as ideas to overcome those barriers, or if I know that they cannot be overcome, to save the study team from spending a lot of time working with that patient who's not going to prove to be a good subject for the trial and generate data towards the hypothesis. And then the last major area where I think it's important to have, or last reason I think it's important to have clinicians as investigators as part of studies, is that they can coordinate with other clinicians in the care of the patient during the conduct of the trial. Clinicians, because they're working with other clinicians, are more likely to have a sense of how the workflows go. For instance, in hospital medicine, we're typically rounding by 8 in the morning. So if we're going to ask the clinical team to introduce the concept of enrollment in a particular clinical trial with those who are caring for the patient, it's important to get that information to the hospitalist before 8 a.m. That allows the clinician not to waste a lot of time making a second trip just for the purpose of the clinical trial. And it helps to introduce the clinical trial workflow into the normal clinical workflow. So communication happens faster, and you get a reduced perception from the clinical workforce that inclusion of research simply increases their clinical workload. We've generated a number of tools to support coordination of care with other clinicians in the conduct of our clinical trials. It's important that clinicians know that their patients are enrolled in a trial. And so we have taken the approach of, again, writing a research note into the patient's chart that documents the fact that the patient has been enrolled in a study. Some studies have multiple enrollments, like this one had a screening enrollment where if the patient passed the screening, they could be enrolled in the full trial. And this could be transparent to everyone taking care of the patient to reduce confusion. Many times clinicians are going to want to know what study drugs the patients are receiving. In an unblinded trial, we were able to write notes in the chart specifically describing what study agents the patient was taking. In this case, it would be crizanlizumab and dapagliflozin, as well as what the doses are and what is the expected duration of those drugs. It can also be done when you're in a randomized controlled trial that's blinded, where we can describe what the study agents would be, what their schedule would be, without having to disclose what whether the patient is on active drug or on placebo. This also allows the ability to include proactively information to the clinicians about how the drug could be modified. In this particular example, if the patient were to have, by the clinician, a decision to discontinue the IV access, then the study drug would be stopped at that point. But you can certainly imagine that there would be other study medications that would have information that the trial team could convey to the clinicians caring for the patient. For instance, if you were working with a study agent that might reduce the need for a diuretic, it might be clearer to the clinicians caring for the patient why they're able to decrease the dose of the diuretic and may help them to make better clinical decisions. As study designs get more and more complex than the ones that I've shown, there may be needs for communicating temporary study drug discontinuation or dose adjustment in the context of events or toxicities. And by documenting in the chart, we can show that investigators are engaging in the trial and looking for things like adverse events and severe adverse events that could be documented that way. So I think there's a number of reasons to involve clinical investigators as part of clinical trials. And I realize that there's a number of challenges of working with people whose primary identity and function is clinical. Many of us are not good about being available, or at least there's that perception. And part of that is because responsibilities in clinics and within patient care can be difficult to interrupt. A lot of times we are scheduled quite tightly. Clinicians, just like everyone else, take vacations, they have illnesses, they have all of the complications that everyone else would have. Additionally, clinicians are not necessarily thinking of themselves as, clinical researchers or human subjects researchers, and unfamiliarity with research, whether it's because it's not front and center in med school and residency or other kinds of training, may lead clinicians to be hesitant about joining clinical trials as study staff. There also may be the sense that these clinicians are overextended and this is just one more thing. I would argue that one way to mitigate these concerns is to have teams of clinician investigators as part of the study team. It's been successful for us in the sense that if we have a number of trialists who can work together as a team, no one person has to be constantly on. I had the experience early in COVID where we had a clinical trial where I was not study staff, but I was caring for a patient who was enrolled in a clinical trial, started on a study agent, and then the safety monitoring for the patient revealed issues that required interventions. Because there were only a small number of clinical investigators that were part of the study staff, we actually got into a situation where we couldn't reach someone in a timely fashion. We did ultimately protect the patient's safety and were able to continue the study without major protocol deviations. But by having a larger group where you can hand off this responsibility, we can make sure that availability is present to ease the conduct of the trial as well as to improve the safety of the subjects. I also argue that by having teams of clinicians, we can deal with the sense of the difference in role. If your only option as an investigator is to be the principal investigator, it's difficult to have to sort of dip a toe into research without feeling overwhelmed. And by having teams, it's possible to have some study activities for which a particular clinician investigator could be responsible and conduct appropriately without overwhelming that person. And with multiple trials, that expertise could build up and we could turn a clinician into a much more seasoned researcher. By doing this in teams, we also create a sense of community. And by having a number of people in a clinical department, for instance, that are part of clinical trials, we make the trial more normalized in the clinical practice, which is something I see as an independent goal. So what we've done in hospital medicine at the UW was to create a group of trialists who work as co-investigators on clinical trials involving our patients. Our group formed during the COVID pandemic. We started with 7 physicians in an APP and have had some significant churn. We've had 5 physicians leave the group and an additional 4 join the group over 3.5 years. So not everyone who tries it wants to continue. And I think that would be a reasonable expectation. We've contributed to 6 clinical trials. They're interventional randomized control trials, 5 involving COVID and 1 that's currently enrolling in an intervention for sepsis. One of our investigators, one of our trialists, I think in part because of the experience with the clinical research, has actually taken on and become the principal investigator of a study investing a quality improvement project to change the course of how we care for patients admitted with acute exacerbations of COPD. So I think we're starting to see additional benefits outside of strict trials themselves. We opened, I think, the first study to have an inpatient at UW Health's community hospital called East Madison Hospital. And we have built a paging schedule that integrates with our clinical scheduling system, as well as to have a pager so that any clinician who needs to get a hold of the hospitalist on call for the day can find us in a fairly straightforward manner. We've been able to pre-screen patients over the last 3.5 years at about 364 days per year. We have had a couple of days where we couldn't provide good coverage. Those tended to be Christmases. So I'm hoping that I've been able to describe that there are reasons to engage clinician investigators. that they can identify challenges with study implementation and help to improve the workflow design for the conduct of the trial. They can document the protocol requirements and demonstrate the engagement in the trial from the investigator point of view. We can improve coordination with clinicians caring for the patients that are enrolled in these clinical trials. We can help to improve patient safety by having adequate coverage from qualified investigators, and that we can expand the reach of clinical trials. I would love to hear from members of this group what their experiences have been and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Rafael and Kraig. There's one question in the chat from Betsy about IRB often approves recruitment using chart review. However, HIPAA rules and UW Health compliance usually does not allow viewing clinical charts for identifying patients by study teams for research. What other options are there to identify patients?
Like I mentioned, when you do the IRB application, one way is requesting a waiver of screening and recruitment, and that will allow you to look at minimal PHI to see if the patient might or might not qualify for the study, and then approach the patient for consent. That's one option.
Great, thank you. Phoebe says, partner with the EDRC program in the ED would be a great solution for identifying and enrolling patients. Phoebe, are you able to take yourself off mute and talk a little bit more about this?
Oh, sure. I'm absolutely happy to. Let me grab my camera too. Hi, everybody. So I'm Phoebe Natsky, and I work in emergency medicine, and I manage a program of research coordinators who work exclusively in the emergency department. So we're a fee-for-service program, and we basically partner with teams across the university, across the School of Medicine, at other academic institutions, as well as with industry partners. And we screen every patient who comes through against eligibility criteria for all the projects in our portfolio. We have pretty extensive coverage because obviously the ED is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Believe it or not, they're always there treating people, saving lives. And we just have a really excellent team. We have a group of early professionals who are all hoping to go on, well, most are hoping to go on to medical school or be involved for the longer duration in clinical or translational research. They're just extremely excellent. The training they go through before becoming independent is remarkable. It's really robust, and we've taken on pretty straightforward projects that involve quality of life measures or survey administration. We've taken on some projects where we simply act as a referral source. So we approach patients and just kind of describe to them that they might be eligible for this type of research, and if they're interested, the study team would reach out to them, and we would simply act as a bridge by providing contact information back to the study team. And we've also recently engaged in protocols that are significantly more complex and involve either a longitudinal component. A lot of our protocols involve biological specimen collection, processing, and storage. So I'll drop the link for our program in the chat, but our menu of services is pretty diverse, and we're just always looking for those partnerships and those collaborations.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Other questions? Betsy asks another question for you, Kraig. What is the best way for an investigator to find a clinical partner so that their trial can be better integrated?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm not sure that I know the ideal way, but the more so if you have a trial that you're thinking about or a protocol that you're thinking about implementing at the UW, thinking through what clinicians care for that patient population and reaching out to either someone that you know as part of that group or the head of that group who can then forward the message to someone who can get you connected. So if a patient is going to be an inpatient on a medicine service, I would love to chat with anybody who would like to conduct trials on medicine in patients And so certainly if you send it to me, I'd be happy to try and get you connected with that group, or if you send it to our division head. I know there are many other groups that have, patients that are clearly not hospital medicine, whether that's, infectious disease or cardiology. And I would think that reaching out to a clinician that is part of that group, they could get you connected to someone who could talk through implementation of your trial.
Thanks very much, Kraig. This has implications for, it's critical to find the right partner because that has implications for engagement and the conduct of the trial. So it's worthwhile taking the time to map out the patient's journey through the health system for the particular condition that you are interested in, because that can look very different from facility to facility, and even within health systems can look very different. Some of the things we find when we review protocols are that the bulk of the recruitment might be happening in the ambulatory setting, but yet there's no ambulatory clinician that's involved in even helping with the trial in any capacity. And so right away, that the study team will run into challenges there. So mapping out that journey, and then that will tell you who are the clinicians that are involved and which group is the right group to approach as a partner.
And we also have to understand that the standard of care that the sponsor says it's not necessarily the standard of care here in Wisconsin. It varies state by state or doctor by doctor. So.
Great, thank you very much. Other questions? I have a question from the perspective of the research team. Sometimes PIs wonder, how can someone else objectively tell that I am engaged? I mean, I am interested in knowing the study endpoints, I'm interested in enrolling. But from the outside looking in, what are some ways that a sponsor or somebody else can tell that the PI is engaged? So Rafael, you shared the FDA letter. What are some things that the PI should think about? If I'm doing these things, that means that I am adequately engaged.
I think Kraig shared some good examples of documentation of the eligibility following the patient progress notes. I think at this time in 2023, we should get away from paper charts and try to document everything in HealthLink. That demonstrates that when Kraig is documenting, you can see his signature and date when he incorporated that. It's real time. So we can also determine that study procedures were done after the signing of informed consent. Also, training logs. The PI, like I mentioned in the initiation visit, is site initiation, especially if it's an investigator initiated with FDA component, they have to keep records of the training that they provided and did, just like a pharmaceutical company has all these logs of training and situation. Also, the communication within the team. How frequently do they communicate? Do they have monitoring visit? Is the PI checking up on the study to make sure it's running adequately, assessing every single time? Demonstrating that we have a meeting once a month is really good for the FDA to see that we're engaged in the conduct of the trial in other aspects.
That sounds great. Those are some really great concrete suggestions for PIs to be aware of. And that was posted in chat as well by Julia. Documentation of regular meetings, agenda minutes is another way. And then Karen Olson has a question. Do investigators have the option of research notes in HealthLink as opposed to progress notes?
Yeah, and I'll take that. At UW Health, our instance of Epic with HealthLink does allow for choosing research note as a note type. So it doesn't create a message for coders to code and bill. And it helps those looking at the notes to know the purpose of the note. I don't know if that's part of Epic standard build. So if you're, at, Gunderson Lacrosse, I don't know if it's true there.
But as the investigator, they can document as a progress note that will still count to the research. The advantage of the research note is for study coordinators, if they need to put something, they can get a co-signing of the PI, and that will reaffirm the engagement of the PI when the note is co-signed by the PI.
That's great, thank you. Last call for questions. We have time for a couple more. Give people a few seconds to think it over. All right, I'm not seeing anything else in chat. Thank you very much to our speakers this afternoon. Really appreciate your insights. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.